Well, let's consider now the thematic flow, and we're coming to some conclusions here. I want to sketch in broad strokes what I believe to be the vivid drama that John is declaring here. And to do so, I need to give you a little Old Testament background. Not enough, but hopefully whet your appetite to do more study. Revelation is the most Old Testament flavored book in all of the New Testament. You cannot read it and understand it very well if you don't understand something of the Old Testament. Much of the Old Testament, in fact. It's important for us to realize that in the Old Testament economy, in the Old Covenant economy, God's wife is Israel, or Jerusalem. Israel is the wife of God. In the Old Testament, God graciously took this little nation of people and married Himself to her in covenant. And that's why in Jeremiah, as she's receiving her first destruction of the temple, the prophet says, "Return, O backsliding children, for I married you." He appeals to Israel to return from the false gods they're following after, and he says, "I married you. You're my wife. Why are you committing adultery against me?" In Jeremiah 31, verse 32, where the new covenant is revealed, he says, "They broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them." But Israel is an unfaithful wife. She commits spiritual adultery by chasing off after foreign gods. Consequently, God sends His lawyers to challenge her. The prophets are God's lawyers. He is covenantally wed to His wife. He entrusts the message to his lawyers, the prophets, and they come against Israel and bring a case, a riv in Hebrew, which means a legal case against Israel. For instance, in Hosea 4:1 and Micah 6:2, we see the very strong legal imagery of a case being brought to Israel. Well, let me give you a few samples here. On the basis of God's law, which effects the covenant between God and Israel, God calls forth witnesses as His lawyers bring Israel to a lawsuit regarding her marital infidelity. He sends His lawyers on the basis of His law, and He brings forth witnesses. Isaiah 1 will be a good sample. Isaiah 1:2, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth." Notice that they are the witnesses. God is calling all of creation to be witness against Israel. "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth. The Lord has spoken and nourished and brought up children, and they rebelled against me." In verse 21 of Isaiah, "How has the faithful city become," you know it, "a harlot?" The same problem exists in the Old Testament that exists in the New. Different historical factors, but the same problem of marital infidelity. Ezekiel 6:9, Hosea 1:2, and Jeremiah 2:2 also refer to Israel's harlotrous, marriage-breaching conduct. All of this covenant imagery and the legal actions involved in that come to bear upon the book of Revelation. For instance, and again we're giving a broad sweep, in Revelation 4, before John sees the actual judgments beginning to unfold, what's the first thing he sees? He looks up into heaven and he sees God seated on His throne as judge. The throne, the word throne appears in 18 of Revelation's 22 chapters. In the whole New Testament, the word throne occurs 62 times, but 47 of those are in the book of Revelation. It is a judicially based book. God is seated in judgment against Israel for spiritual adultery, for harlotrous conduct, and therefore the throne is thrust to the front of the book of Revelation. In fact, the language in Revelation has a Judaical cast, not Judaical, but a judicial cast all the way through. There's the language of judgment, wrath, witness, and things of this sort that come right out of courtroom terminology. But what's about to be judged? Why is God seated upon the throne? Why is there so much judicial imagery in the book of Revelation? I'm sure you're already suspecting where I'm going with this. But in Revelation 5, while He's seated on the throne, He hands out a seven-sealed scroll, which I believe represents God's divorce decree against Israel. It's His bill of divorcement against Israel. He is divorcing this harlot so that He can take a new bride, the church. That's the imagery, the judicial imagery in Revelation. The scroll is the bill of divorcement. We read of a bill of divorcement in Deuteronomy 24 and Matthew 19, not against Israel, but just the Old Testament legal structure of bill of divorcement. And John is picking up on imagery that Jeremiah has already used in chapter 3. In Jeremiah 3:8, Jeremiah says, I saw that for all the adulteries of faithless Israel, I had sent her away and given her a writ of divorcement. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she went away and acted as a harlot also. See the judicial element, the bill of divorcement, and the harlotrous conduct of the people of Israel. Of course, he's speaking of the two parts, northern and southern Israel. And interestingly, in that same passage in Jeremiah 3, we just read verse 8, but in verse 3, he says, you had the head of the forehead of a harlot. You had the forehead of a harlot. And in Revelation, the forehead of the harlot is expressly mentioned. Jeremiah is writing about the original Babylonian captivity, and John is writing about a new captivity. And now Babylon is really Jerusalem herself. She's as bad as that old enemy of God. John is speaking of a new Babylon who causes the temple to be destroyed, Jerusalem. The scroll reflects the judicial imagery found in Ezekiel and Leviticus. For instance, in Ezekiel 2, Ezekiel is given a scroll that's written on the front and back. Now this is unusual because the way scrolls were made, they pasted the papyrus up on the back, running up like that, and then across like this on the front. So it's easy to write across the front, but it's very awkward to write across the back because of the seams. But when a scroll is written on front and back, it's filled with information, so much information that not just one side is used, but even awkwardly the back side. Well, in Ezekiel 2, Ezekiel has a scroll written against Israel, written on the front and back, and when you read Revelation 5:1, there's a scroll presented, written on the front and back also. In Ezekiel 2 and 3, we find that scroll deals with Jerusalem's devastation. We find that going on in the book of Revelation in chapters 6 through 19, except for some interruptions here and there. The 7 seals on the scroll seem to reflect Leviticus chapter 26, where he mentions 4 times this. I'll give you the 4 verse references and then I'll just quote it once. Verses 18, 21, 24, and 28. If also after these things you do not obey me, then will I punish you 7 times more for your sins. He says that 4 times. This idea of a full judgment, a 7-fold judgment upon Israel, I think is informing us with the notion of this 7-sealed scroll of divorce. Now, interestingly, after chapter 5, God has to capitally punish his adulterous wife, because is not adultery capitally punishable as a crime in the Old Covenant economy? Well, he capitally punishes her. Divine judgments fall upon Jerusalem in chapter 6 through 19 with a few interruptions for the beast and things like that. Interestingly, in Leviticus 20 verse 10, the adulterer was to be capitally punished by being stoned to death. While discussing Babylon's destruction in chapter 16 verse 19, Babylon is mentioned in 16:19, while discussing that, in verse 21, 16:21 we read, great hail from heaven fell upon men. Every hailstone was the weight of a talent. So as he's speaking of Babylon's judgment, she's stoned to death. Hailstones fall from heaven. Now, interestingly and very fascinating, Josephus, who was a Jew, not a Christian, a Jew who lived during the Roman siege, he at first was on the Jewish side. He was captured and then gave himself over to Vespasian and tried to get the Jews to surrender. So he was on both sides of the conflict. He records for us the siege of Jerusalem. Now remember, in Revelation 16:21, it says, great hail weighing 1 talent each fell upon the city. Hailstones weighing 1 talent each. What color is hail? It's white. What size is it? 1 talent. What does Josephus tell us about the siege? In Wars 5:6-3, he says, quote, the catapults that all the legions had prepared for them were admirably contrived. But still more extraordinary ones belong to the 10th legion, those that threw darts and those that threw stones. The stones that were cast were of a weight of a talent, and were carried 2 furlongs and further. As for the Jews, they at first watched the coming of the stone, for it was white. What John is doing poetically, apocalyptically, is giving a picture of the Roman legions, the 10th legion particularly, throwing white talent weight hailstones on this city from all sides, except where the Kidron Valley is and they couldn't get to. But Jerusalem is being assaulted, and talent weight stones are falling upon her. Josephus gives us the historical record as a catapult assault. John is giving us an apocalyptic foreview in a poetic description. Now, having legally disposed of his harlotrous wife, Revelation turns to consider what? A new bride. God's old bride has committed adultery. She's capitally punished. She's put away. And so in the end of Revelation, we see a new bride coming down out of heaven. In fact, in Revelation 19, the siege of Jerusalem becomes, in effect, according to chapter 19, the marriage supper of the Lamb. In Revelation 21:2, he says, "Then I saw a holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband." This bride is a new Jerusalem, which fills the void left by the old Jerusalem just judged. And that's the same imagery of Galatians 4 and Hebrews 12. Therefore, Revelation, I believe, is teaching us of God's divorce of Israel as His special, beloved people, because they have committed a final transgression to Him that is so horrible. He's divorced her, He capitally punishes her, and He turns to take a new bride and marries the church coming down from above. Now, let me just caution you. I don't believe that that's it for Israel. I believe Israel will experience a glorious renewal in the eyes of God. However, I believe that for Israel as a racial people, but I don't believe as a national entity there's any significance to that. Israel as a racial people was judged, and their national claim to fame, their national standing with God, has been destroyed. He's taken a new bride, the church. But lo and behold, by the grace of God, all who profess the name of Christ can enter the church as Christians, not as Jews. The old Israel, the old political structure that God used in the Old Testament to secure His Word and His will in the world has been done away with. So Revelation explains, it justifies, and it warns about the removal of Jerusalem. We must remember the original audience, the near-time expectation, and the leading characters of the book. Thank you.